Take it away, Gabrielle.
All right, guys. Well, hi, everybody. He did a pretty good introduction, so I'll just start you out with my project, which is Marshbird Community Assemblage and Vegetation Association in Emergent Wetlands. And we'll just jump right in here. So the objectives for the meeting today are we're going to talk about how this project got started. We're going to talk about some of the challenges of studying marsh birds, kind of go over like a quick just current knowledge on each species that I'm looking at, some of their challenges that they face, how ARUs can actually help. And if you're wondering what an ARU is, it's just an autonomous recording unit. And then what we've learned so far. So this project actually it didn't get started, but it got, we started discussion on it way back in the summer of 2018. A friend and I were actually birding, and we went to the Choctaw Island WMA. And while we were there, we were actually actively looking for king rails. And we found 2 juvenile king rails. And this represented the first recorded reproduction for king rails in the state since 2006. So what happened is we kind of started wondering like why it had been so long since king rails had been seen or had been documented reproducing in the state. And we wondered what we could do about it. So this sort of got us thinking, well, what is a marsh bird and what makes them so difficult to find? And so marsh birds are just sort of classified as secretive. This is because you don't see them or hear them very often. This can be because their call rates are low, but also because of the environment that they live in, which is, you know, shallowly flooded emergent marsh, which people just don't go to very often. For this particular project, we're looking at birds in 2 specific families. We're looking at least bitterns, king rails, Virginia rail, Sora, common Galano, and purple Gallonal in Ardeaday and Rallidae. Forgive me if I don't say those right, because I have a terrible time pronouncing them. Our first bird is the least bittern. It is the smallest member of the heron family. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen them before, but when you get out and you find them, they can actually be pretty vocal. They tend to forage along the edge of open water, and as you can see in this picture, they grasp on clumps of this emergent vegetation with their feet. They tend to be sort of a blackish green on top, and then more of a kind of brown and white below. For Arkansas, they're here in the summertime. This is breeding range for them. And this marsh bird is, in general, in decline. This decline is linked with the loss of emergent wetlands, but also, weirdly enough, they seem to be kind of heavy on car strikes. And so in areas where roads are going through potential habitat, that can be detrimental to them. Just checking that I hit all my notes here. Yeah. So one of the things of management concern for this species is that they want to identify migration and stopover habitat. In general, migration tends to be understudied for marsh birds. And so we all know that migration is an important portion of the life cycle. So they really want to identify key areas for this species. The king rail, it's a large rail. Brooke Meanley, back in the 50s, used to call this species very common in Arkansas, particularly around the Stuckart area in the rice fields. He said it was not unusual to see 10 to 15 per day. They use emergent marsh, and they're also known to use rice fields in states like Arkansas and Texas, Louisiana, places like that. In Arkansas, they are a resident bird, but range-wide, they've pretty well experienced significant declines. These declines are due to wetland loss. Interestingly enough, hydrological changes. The hydro period can be really important to this species. And in Arkansas particular, their decline seems to be linked with the dredging of agricultural ditches. The agricultural ditches would have emergent cattails that this species would actually use for habitat, while the rice fields would grow. And so the removal of this seems to have been associated with their decline in Arkansas. Their major threats, again, are habitat loss, particularly of emergent wetland and rice. Historically, the Mississippi Alluvial Valley was a very important area for them, especially for breeding and migratory habitat. This area has experienced major habitat degradation and loss. So this area is particularly important for this species, and we are really concerned with the habitat in this area. They are listed as a species of conservation concern, and they are also listed as either threatened or endangered in 12 US states. Again, like with the least bittern, there are definite needs to understand migration better for this species. The timing of their migration is pretty poorly understood. So Virginia rails. This species uses freshwater wetlands. It is a winter resident in the state. It seems to be doing pretty well for the most part, but it is experiencing decline in certain areas. Again, like with the other rails and least bittern, their population trends aren't really well known. They're fairly poorly understood for portions of their life cycle. Some of the reasons we don't know or we don't have good information on their population trends is just because sampling for this species, or all rails in general, is kind of inadequate. Most of our knowledge comes from breeding bird surveys, which inadequately sample emergent marsh habitat. They have started with the standardized Marshbird surveys, but again, we still don't have all the information to know exactly what's going on with these populations. Like the other rails, their threats are habitat loss and, again, with the least bittern, vehicle strikes. All right, Sora. So Sora is probably one of my favorite little birds. They're just super cute. I love their whinny call. They're one of the most abundant rails. They're very widespread. They use freshwater wetlands, wetland edges, and row crops that are sort of near water. So they're more of a generalist species than some of our other rails. They migrate through the state. And their populations are considered to be pretty stable, but they do face issues the same as the others with habitat loss and degradation. So the common Gallonal, this is a summer resident. They tend to breed here. They use a lot of different landscapes. And they will readily, I'm sorry, they don't use a lot of different landscapes. They will use landscapes altered by humans readily. They tend to use a little bit different than the other rails. They will use more deeper water and water that can be permanently flooded. Again, with this species, we lack information on their population trends. In general, they seem to be doing okay, but they have had habitat losses that have been linked with local declines. And the purple Gallonal, I love this species. They are probably, well, they are absolutely the brightest colored marsh bird. Really vibrant, blue, green, purple, bright yellow legs, red bill, just beautiful species. Like the common Gallonal, they're summer resident. They are, in general, doing well. We sort of think We've had declines related with habitat loss, especially in like the Mississippi alluvial valley of like Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and then over in Florida and Texas. These areas are their main summer breeding areas, and so habitat loss in these areas has caused some issues for them, but that's sort of been countered or benefited by rice production. They are considered to be an endangered breeding species in Arkansas, but they are also, again, facing threats from habitat loss. I didn't post like on the other ones. I had a little bullet list of my points I wanted to hit. I switched this out for this species because I've had an interesting 2 years worth of observations for this species that I'd love to get some more information on. I found notes that there's no records of double brooding in Arkansas, and I'm not saying at all that I have evidence of double brooding, but in 2019 and again in 2020, I have seen purple gallinals with older, fully fledged juveniles and younger chicks. In 2019 in particular, the fully fledged juvenile took 2 of the little black fuzzy chicks off on its own and was feeding them. So I've had fun observations with this species, and it's one of my favorite to watch. And I think if there's a little bit more study on it, we might learn a little bit more interesting information about this species here in the state. Okay, just a quick breakdown here for Arkansas. This comes from the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission website, and this is just global rank for each of these species that I'm looking at as Arkansas looks at it. Each of these species are in need of inventory for Arkansas. Most of them are globally secure. The king rail is apparently globally secure. Our state ranks differ a little bit. So for the least bittern, the breeding population is considered to be pretty rare. The king rail breeding population is to be considered extremely rare, and then the purple Gallonal also extremely rare, and then the common Gallonal very rare. Okay, so the threats for these species in our state. Overall, loss of habitat is the major concern for these species, habitat loss, habitat degradation. In particular, the king rail is suffering from severe declines. We have, in the United States, experienced a 56% loss of wetland habitat. In Arkansas in particular, we've lost approximately 72% of our wetland habitats. This hasn't all been emergent wetland, but historically Arkansas had about 28% of the state covered in wetlands, and we now currently have about 8% covered in wetlands, so major losses in Arkansas. Many of these losses have been due to rural or urban development, also timber operations and agriculture. This accounts for 77% of the wetland loss in the state. Overall, most years we've experienced wetland loss across the United States. We did have some years around 2009 where the emergent wetlands actually experienced a net gain throughout the United States. But Arkansas and the lower Mississippi River Valley did not actually follow that trend. In those years, emergent wetlands actually experienced a loss in this area. And this area is super important for many, many birds. This area supports 60% of the migratory and wintering habitat for like all US bird species. So continuing to experience losses in these areas is obviously going to affect our bird populations. Not just for reproduction, but also migration and wintering habitat is important. You know, they need to stay healthy on migration. They need to stay healthy during the winter. So whenever they go to reproduce, they can reproduce successfully. So the Arkansas River Delta area contained many of these losses. A lot of these emergent wetlands have been converted to other uses now. So that brings us to what we are doing with my study. My objective is to determine if temporal trends in occupancy patterns through the spring and fall migration. We are doing this by taking these ARUs, these autonomous recording units, and we place them in 4 different locations. And these units record sound. And so we are looking to document marshbird occupancy during migration, and we are looking to indicate stopover habitat types so that it can help answer some management questions and things like that that we might have relating to these birds. So our pros and cons for these ARUs, they have some really, really nice pros. You can deploy them for long periods of time. The longer these are deployed, the more likely you are to detect a bird. You know, if we're doing bird surveys, you're spending 5 minutes in a location, maybe 3 times. And so it's kind of hit or miss of whether or not you're going to detect it. With my ARUs, we actually have these deployed for several months at a time, and they run every day. So you're just a little bit more likely to catch on the right day. These ARUs provide a permanent record. These are recordings that you can keep, you can archive, you can keep them as long as you want. It also makes it really easy where if you have questions, like say you think you heard a bird in the field, but you weren't sure, you have that recording that you can go back and you can look at, you can have other people verify. It's just really nice to have the permanent record. They also cause less habitat disturbance. You just go out, you place these recorders, you don't have to spend a lot of time walking through the marsh. There are some studies that have looked at marsh birds in the fall, and the way they tend to detect them in the fall, since marsh birds tend to not call very often, is they'll actually walk out through the marsh. So that can be rather disturbing for this species. And then you also have less time, less travel, less people in the field. You're less likely to alter the bird's behavior based on your presence, things like that. The cons, they're expensive. I have 2 different types of recorders. I have the Song Meter Minis, and then I have the Song Meter 4s. The Song Meter Minis are $500 a piece. The Song Meter 4s are $1,000 a piece, so they're quite expensive. Parts are also quite expensive. I think replacement microphones are like $250. You also have to maintain these. You have to replace batteries, you have to replace SD cards, you need to go out and you need to check them, just different things like that. There's also lots of data, so you have to have something to be able to store your data with. And because there's lots of data, there's really long data processing hours, so it can take a long time to go through all the data that you've got together. All right, so our deployment. So we placed 21 ARUs. These ARUs are in 4 different locations. These locations are Arkansas Post National Memorial, which is a national park. Some of this, portions of the park, not the whole park, has some emergent marsh habitat. Trust and Holder WMA, the reason why they're together on the map over here is because these locations are quite close together, and I have recording units on both of those in some of the marsh habitat that's there. We also have 2 private landowners that have allowed us access onto their property. One is an approximately like a 2-acre site that has some small amount of emergent marsh on a WRP, and the other is 33 acres, and that's pretty well cattail type marsh surrounding a small bayou. These recorders have been deployed from March through May, and then from September through November. They had cameras originally in the spring because we were hoping to also get some photo documentation. We ran into really quickly, because these are in emergent marsh, and your cameras are set up to trigger whenever there's movement. Once the cattails grew up and got large, every time the wind would blow, the cameras would go off, and we'd have 4,000 pictures of cattails moving back and forth. And so we ended up scrapping the cameras for the fall season. But so far, the ARUs have worked really nicely. We're taking vegetation measurements. We're using a 25-meter radius. Our plot center is the ARU pole itself. We take water depth. We measure tall emergent vegetation. That's going to be vegetation greater than 1 meter tall. And for that, you're looking at species like cattail or like woolgrass, things like that. And then we're measuring short emergent vegetation, which is vegetation that's under 1 meter tall. Things like that, or lizard's tail, or seed box, some of those different species. We measure the percentage of woody vegetation, and then we're measuring the vegetation to water interspersion, which is basically how much water there is next to vegetation. We're actually doing this by drawing this on a grid. We ran into some challenges with the environment. As you can see in the picture, it's pretty shallowly flooded, but there's a lot of mud. In this location, it was pretty easy to access. The mud wasn't very deep, but one of our locations, the mud, it's just almost impossible to walk out in it, waist high. So it presented some unique challenges. We couldn't get a boat in because the water's too shallow, but we couldn't walk out because the mud was too deep. So we had to come up with some different ways to go about this sampling. And then our recorders are running from 30 minutes before sunrise to 2 hours after, and then 2 hours before sunset to 30 minutes after. So like I mentioned just a minute ago, we face a few challenges while doing this work. Like I said, the mud is so very deep. Then we've also had some issues with flooding and accessibility. One of our sites flooded up over 5 feet of water within 48 hours. We lost all our cameras at that site, and as you can see, we very nearly lost the ARUs. We had to take kayaks in to get it. Just emergent habitat, and you're in a wetland habitat, and that can be pretty changeable pretty quickly. Hunting season in the fall has been an issue. We've had to pull some recorders out of some of the private land locations early due to hunting season and the disturbance that we would cause to the private landowners. Cold weather has oddly been an issue. The smaller recorders use just AA batteries. They work really, really well as long as the temperature is above freezing. But at night, if it gets down kind of around freezing, it will actually kill the batteries pretty quickly. So you have to change them more often. And then in general, these are marsh birds, particularly some of the rail grunts can be difficult to distinguish, especially when it's on a recording and you don't really have anything to orient yourself to. All right, so for my analyses, what you're looking at is a spectrogram. This is some of the output from the program that I'm using. This program is called Kaleidoscope, and it takes the wave files from my recordings and it attempts to cluster them into groups of similar calls. It produces the spectrogram, which is the visual output, and then it also has the audio associated with each particular sound wave. This output allows you to go through, and you can go through each cluster, like it will produce a list of clusters. And so you can go to each cluster and listen and see it, and then verify, like, yes, this is, say, like a red-winged blackbird, or whatever species that you're looking for. You can verify it, you can save it, it will save as an Excel file, and then that Excel file is what I will use to create a detection, non-detection matrix. We intend to use that for dynamic occupancy modeling. Right now, though, I'm still working on going through data. We've hit a couple snags. This particular program is not very good at picking out the rail calls. It doesn't recognize them very well. So we've been doing some work with different settings and things to be able to tease those calls out a little bit better. Okay, and so what I have here is just sort of one of the things that I struggled with personally. The calls need to be manually identified. And so once you go through there, they've clustered, you go through your clusters and you're like, hey, this cluster has some rails in it. So I definitely want to look at this cluster. So then you would go through and you can visually look at it, and visually you can look and say, well, the top one, that's a rail call. It obviously looks like a rail call, but sometimes you can have similar species that can possibly get confused with it, especially after you've gone through a lot of data. I tend to have issues, you know, you'll be going through data for a couple hours and then everything starts to sound the same. So just listen to the sound. So there's your Virginia rail with a Sora on the end of it. And then that's the green tree frog, which right now doesn't seem like it sounds super similar, but they're similar enough that after you've done it for a few hours and gotten tired that you're like, gosh, this rail's a little hoarse sounding today, and you know, but it's really not. It's the green tree frog. So it's really nice that we can go back and we can verify this stuff. What I've done to avoid getting confused when I'm processing my sound is I've actually built a portfolio of examples. So I have example rail calls, example Sora calls, and example least Bittern calls right now. We haven't actually gotten to processing the common Gallonal or the purple Gallonal yet. So I have a good portfolio full of these calls with both sound and the spectrogram that I can go back and I can check out. And if I have any questions, I can look at those first, or I also occasionally email sounds that I just need verified. So that's one of the ways I make sure I'm trying to stay on my calls. So I just put together a little list here of different species that we've found so far, and play them for you. So we've got 2 different Sora calls. So we've got the whinny, and then we tend to find this one a lot. Here we. And then we have the least Bittern, which can actually sound a whole lot like an owl. And I'm going to go ahead and play it, and just hopefully no one tells me this is an owl and it's done confused me again, because this one is one of my worst ones. So there was our least Bittern, and then of course our Virginia rail. Okay, so this is what I do. I go through, I visually look at them, I listen to them, and then I assign them a classification based on what I identify it as. So currently what we have is we have had Sora detected at all of our sites. We have had Virginia rail and least Bittern detected at 3 at the Tichenor site, at the Arkansas Post, and at the Trust and Holder site. We have had common Gallanal and purple Gallanal at the Arkansas Post, Trust and Holder site. Our Tichenor site possibly had a breeding pair of least Bitterns. We didn't walk through the habitat and look for a nest or anything, but every time we walked out to it, we would flush a pair of least Bitterns. And we have also had a fairly late Virginia rail that was here almost into June at the Titchener site. When we were checking our plots at the Arkansas Post site, we had a late purple Gallonal as well, right at the end of October. Currently, we don't have any calls for a king rail, which kind of hurts my feelings, but hopefully we'll find one before we get done. Okay, so for this slide, this is actually sort of a, like, just for fun, test your knowledge kind of slide. So you guys can post in the chat section. I'm not sure that I can see the chat. Dan, can you see the chat?
I can, and you will be able to as well.
It'll pop up, okay.
If you want to.
All right, great. So I will play each call and then give you guys a minute to toss in a chat and see if you can identify it. I picked some fairly easy birds.
You want to play that again?
I'll play it again. It's kind of short.
So if you think you know what that bird is, you can type it in the chat box.
Oh, while we're sitting here for a second, I saw Barry had mentioned insulating the battery compartment. That's actually a really good possibility for us. I'd like to look into doing that. 0 skills on sound. All right, so yep, Kevin, that's a cardinal. It's not a marshbird, definitely a cardinal. Okay, you guys ready to move on to the next one?
Go for it.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Yep, Mr. Dixon got it. That's a marsh wren. I may have to escape out of this. I don't know how do I go back? There we go. Let's go back. Sorry, guys. I'm still new to the whole Zoom thing. All right, one last bird species. And that one's kind of low. You may have to listen close. I don't know if you guys could hear that one or not. Yep, definitely is Carolina chickadee. Okay, so these aren't bird calls, but I thought I would give you guys an opportunity to identify some of the fun sounds that I've also captured on these recordings. Anybody have a guess on that one?
Play it again, please.
Yep, it's a coyote. How about that one? You can find it in a marsh. Yep, alligator. Honestly, that's one of my favorite sounds. You snoring. Yeah, definitely an alligator. Okay, and this last one. All right, anybody have an idea about the last one? A fox is a good guess. It is, it's a bobcat. Definitely a chupacabra. So, you know, if you're looking at these calls, you can go through and once you've developed your portfolio, you can actually go through and you can identify some of these just by looking at them. So if we go back, like the Sora calls, the whinny call is usually really distinctive. Like you can always tell that's a Sora. Sometimes it's harder to see than others. The least bittern one can be pretty hard to pick out. It can look like a southern leopard frog whenever it shows up, and the leopard frogs can sound somewhat similar. Y'all already saw where the rails can look similar to tree frog species, but it's kind of nice that you have a visual representation of it and you can just go through and you can look at it visually. So basically what we're hoping to do with this is, you know, we want to investigate how well the ARUs detect marsh birds, and in the future, hopefully expand this study to include larger portions of Arkansas than we currently are. We also want to provide information on marsh birds and their habitats during migration, because this is an understudied period of time, and basically any new information we get will help to inform management decisions and give us extra information about this species or these species. Just to wrap up, I just want to give thanks to, you know, everybody who's helped me in my project. Number one, this is actually an unfunded project. So it has been really, really helpful to everyone who has participated and, you know, provided funds or provided equipment to do this study. So the National Park Service and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they graciously allowed me to get a permit to sample on this public land. My private landowners, my Mr. Leonard, Mr. Fortenberry, Mr. Beaker, they have been fantastic. They have really worked with me and provided amazing access to some really nice properties. The Lower Mississippi River Valley Joint Venture, they bought a large portion of my ARUs, and the scope of this project could not be the size that it is without them. Arkansas Audubon Society Trust provided some funding for ongoing maintenance operations, so we really appreciate that. And then I have a couple fellow graduate students who have been super helpful and who have been out with me in the mud and the muck and, you know, helped go out with me every time. So I really appreciate them, Catherine Cody and Starla Phelps. And then my committee members, Dr. Doug Osborne, who's my major professor. Then I have Dr. Ariel Fornor and Dr. John Dennis. They have, you know, been really helpful with just in general providing me with good information and sound advice. And I just really appreciate everything they've done for me. Ariel in particular has been really great with helping me identify calls that confuse me. So really, really appreciate everyone's help. Okay, and we are on to the question portion of this. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to hear them.
Thank you, Gabrielle. If you have questions, type them in the chat box. I've got a question. So okay. There are pros and cons to the recording units versus doing surveys in person. Now that you've had experience with the ARUs, if there was another student coming up behind you wanting to replicate your study, what would you recommend? ARUs or surveys or some combination?
I think, so they've actually done studies where they do the ARUs in conjunction with like point counts, and they've found a little bit of varying different information. In some studies, the ARUs perform better, and in some studies, they perform worse than the human counterparts. I think for the marshbirds, I really like the ARUs just because I know how much time I've spent in the field trying to find particular birds, and it's like a day in, day out process, and I don't think it's really feasible to have someone in the field doing a project as often as, to me, the ARUs seem more useful because they can be out there longer. Don't get me wrong, I love being in the field. I love doing the surveys, but I feel like the ARUs can be really useful for this particular species. So I would definitely suggest the ARUs. I don't think it would hurt to have potentially someone also do point counts in certain locations, just to be able to be like, well, the ARUs had this rate of detectability and then the human counterpart had this rate. So I don't think that would be a bad thing to do at all. But I love the ARUs. I think they're a great tool, and I've really enjoyed using them.
So for secretive birds that don't call as often, ARUs would be beneficial compared to the common forest songbirds that are constantly singing, you think?
Exactly. Just because they're harder to find, and so the longer they're out there, the more likely you are to catch them calling. On the downside, when you're processing the data, if you've got 100,000 red-winged blackbird calls like I have, and potentially 5 or 10 king rail calls, like, you know, the calls that I haven't found yet, the clustering doesn't work when you have a really low rate of or low number of calls like that. So then you have to wade through. So you're potentially either going to miss those calls even though you've had them recorded, or you need to go by and specifically look for them manually to be able to pull them out, which is extremely time consuming.
Thanks. So another question is, what led you into this particular type of project?
Yeah, like I mentioned at the first, we found those 2 juvenile king rails, and we just wondered what made it so difficult to find rails to view reproduction or just to see them in general. So we had wondered about that, and then once we looked into it a little bit more and got to know a little bit more about the issues, we were wondering what we could do to make it easier or make our current techniques better.
Any idea what effects agricultural chemicals may have on these marsh birds?
I believe I have read there was one little blip about chemicals. I can't remember for which particular species that it had talked about. But I do know bobwhite, which of course are not a marsh bird, but I know bobwhite have been shown to kind of have some chemicals and be negatively affected by that after they ingest insects that may have been feeding an agricultural field. So I would assume there's probably some level of that impacting marsh birds as well.
What is your sample size for each species? How many have you found of each species so far?
I really could not say so far. We're really on just the first steps of our data processing. We've done a lot of different tests. So we've definitely found more Sora than anything else, which is not really unexpected. There's probably around, I bet there's probably 50 to 70 Virginia rail calls and probably about an approximately the same number of least bittern calls. But you also have to think, I haven't went and looked at these by like which times these calls are being made. So I may have quite a number of calls for one particular species, but if they're made within, like, say every 10 seconds, it's probably the same bird calling versus you hear one at 7 o'clock and one at 9 o'clock. So I may have a lot of calls, but I may not be able to put a number to it, basically.
Right, so you're looking more at presence, absence. It's difficult to detect how many individuals are actually occupying that marsh.
Correct.
So how do you see this information being used in the future?
I feel like what I would like to see is this project expanded, and really so we can get down, we can identify important areas, particularly like migration areas for these birds. Because migration is so understudied, we don't really have a whole lot of information about it. And we could be losing, I'm sure we are losing, migratory habitat and stopover habitat. And if that's gone, where do the birds go? So I feel like if we have more recorders, we're able to expand this further, then we would be able to identify important areas that these birds use, and say, especially areas that have a number of different marsh birds using it, and say, like, this is an area in particular that we really need to protect, or maybe we can restore it or something like that. Choctaw Island is restored WRP, so I feel like that really highlights that, if you have the correct habitat, these birds will be there. We just need to find what areas they're using, and make sure we protect that in the future.
Great, thanks. Any other questions? Well, I hope that you will, maybe after your study is done, submit some of those rare bird records to the Bird Records Committee, put some of your data in eBird along with some of the recordings that you have. And I was thinking for that, the potential double-brooded purple gallinule might be worth contacting the authors of the Birds of the World account and letting them know what you found.
Yeah, I definitely plan on looking into that, because I feel like that's really, it's at least worth a second look, so that's really interesting. I think it's a fun observation. I love watching them. I work there as well, so I get the opportunity to watch them all the time. So I have a great time just sitting out there with them and watching the marsh.
You never know what you'll find when you're out birding. Always
exactly.
Something new to learn.
Oh, thanks, Jacob.
Well, thank you, Gabrielle, for sharing your research with us and your passion for marsh birds. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in.